Hello, this is John Wes coming to you again from maxcookie.com. This is going to be the last section of the White Storm cave tutorial. I'm going to be going over how to set up the materials and lighting for the cave. Here I've already started bringing in the OBJs from Zbrush, the high poly that we made. I haven't brought in the back wall, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Just by coming over here to import again, going to where you exported your high polys, and I'm going to go ahead and grab cave back wall high poly. I'm also turning off this import materials. I don't want to bring in any materials from Zbrush since I'll be using my own anyway. Just hit the import. It'll take a second to update, and you'll see here it's brought in the back cave wall. Something else I like to do is rename. Sometimes the names out of Zbrush are a little strange, so I'm just going to call this back wall high poly. And now I still have all my low poly stand-ins. I don't want to necessarily get rid of those. Sometimes they can be useful if you're going to come back and do animation or test out a lighting setup, and you may want to bring those low poly objects back. So here in my layers, I'm just going to move all my low poly rocks to this rocks layer. Let's call this rocks low. And then also create a new layer and call this rocks high. Just so I can separate out my low rocks and the high poly rocks. So here in the schematic view that I just opened, I can go in. I'm gonna also move my character. So I'm gonna grab all these low poly rocks and just hit the plus to add selection to layer. And now grab all my high poly rocks and put them on the rocks high layer. And now if under hide here, if I hit this little light bulb, you'll see it hid all my low poly geo. Let's just save this really quick. And now we can start putting some materials on the objects. First of all, I kind of want to duplicate this camera. Just Control V, do a copy, and I'm just going to call this camera render, just so I know it's my render camera, so I can keep my concept camera there in case I need to animate this one. I can still keep my original. And then here under render setup, I just want to change. Let's see. Should have. Oh, I need to change it here. Camera render. Okay, and now we've got that set to our render camera. Okay, now for creating materials, first I just want to come over here to my create lights. I'm going to be using Vray for my render, so I'm going to select the Vray in the drop-down. If that's not available, you may need to go here to your render settings, and under your assign renderer, make sure it's set to Vray. And I'm just going to grab a Vray light, and here in the top view, just drag out selection just to get a square light and position it above my scene. And this is just going to be a placeholder light just for setting up my materials. And then here under the modify settings, I'm just going to set its intensity to 1 and turn on no decay. So it'll be like an infinite light. And I'll just start setting up my materials. So here in I like using this slate material editor. If you go here to modes, you can click on it, slate material editor. I prefer it over the compact, just because it's node based. So I'm just going to grab here a Vray material and drag it over. I'm going to call this rocks. Later I'll also be copying it to make the one for the rock wall. And from here, I've got a few settings that I know work, so I'm going to be using those, but I'll be explaining them as well. So here I'm just going to grab this bitmap, and again just dragging them over and left click or releasing. And now I want to grab my rock diffuse. I'll be including all these textures, so you'll have them. This is going to be the basis for my color channel on the rocks. Also, if you search up here by name, you can find Vray Dirt. This is basically like an ambient occlusion that gets, calculated the texture. So I'm going to be using this to get some ambient occlusion on my rocks as well. So here I'm just going to set this to 1 meter, which is the distance that it stops calculating the ambient occlusion. So I don't want to go over 1 meter. And set the subdivisions to 16. This will just reduce the noise and make it a little smoother. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab the little circle here, the node for my texture, plug it into unoccluded, and let go, and then plug the dirt into the diffuse. And you'll see, if I double click here to increase this, you'll see this updating. And you'll have a bunch of settings here in the V-Ray material as well. Most of these I'm just going to be leaving and having them all driven by textures. So here I'm going to grab another one of my images. I'm going to grab my bump, and I'm also going to grab my spec. And now, see for the spec I'm going to be using for both the reflection and the reflection glossy. V-Ray materials don't necessarily have a separate spec like you may be used to. It's all driven by the reflection. So I'm going to come down here to my color correct node, drag that out, and this is what I'm going to use to edit my maps. So in the color correct for brightness, I'm going to do a -40 and a -80 on the contrast, just to create this kind of dark, this very almost black image that's going to be my reflection, because I don't want a whole lot of reflections on these rocks. They're more of a matte finish. And then I'm going to grab another color correction, and this is going to drive how the glossy is. It's going to determine how sharp or diffuse the spec appears, or the reflection. And so now this is going to be brightness of 15 and the contrast to -90. So it's going to be almost a flat gray. And you can increase or decrease the brightness to darken or lighten this. This will affect how much spec there is. So if you have too much or too little, change that brightness. So this is going to go into reflect gloss, and you'll see the spec appear here. And then finally, my bump map is just going to go straight into the bump map here. And if I double click the rocks to bring up that, I can come down here to maps and see my bump value. I'm just going to increase that to 50. Also on the spec and the diffuse, I want to change this blur value to 0.1, just so that I'm getting a little sharper an image. The bump I want to leave at 1, just to give it a little bit of information to transition. It'll make the bump look a little nicer. And then from here, I also want to add a V-Ray blend material to plug this rocks into. Just going to call this rocks blend. And this just helps if I ever want to add additional nodes or replace this node. Instead of reapplying the texture, I can just unplug this, plug a new texture in, and anything attached to this node will get the update. So it makes making overall changes to the scene really easy. So from here, I want to select all my rocks except for the floor and the back wall. So let me grab, again here in the schematic view, and just holding Control to add objects to the selection. So I'm leaving off the ground and the back wall. So now with all those selected, I can come back here to my material, right click, assign material to selection. And now this material is just applied to all those rocks. So I'm going to come in here and set up some render settings so we can preview this. I'm just going to have this set to single. I'm going to have our resolution just because we're doing a kind of preview, so I'm going to turn this down to 512, and the width will change as well to match since I have my ratios locked. I'm just going to pick an export location. I'm just going to call this test, make it a JPEG, hit save. Yes, I want to override. And then there's a few Vray settings that I like. Keeping this at adaptive DMC, and then on the anti-aliasing, the Vray Lacaze filter, and setting this to 2 is good for just a preview, and the default is good for a preview. I'm going to uncheck this. These are all good default settings for preview. You don't want to use these for final. We'll be changing them later. And everything else should be fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and do reset this to render camera and hit this to lock it. And now just hit render. So I want to override. And it'll be doing a quick calculation here. See, the walls don't have their texture yet, or the floor, but this rock should be getting a texture already. So you can see the bump map that I'm using is adding a bit of detail to these rocks as well, to what we sculpted in. One additional thing here. Let me go ahead and cancel this. Is on the textures here, I want to tile them since they're a little small. So if I go back in here and double click on each of these, I'm just going to increase the tiling to 2 on all these. Okay, and that's looking the way I want it to. Again, a lot of these are being driven by these maps. The glossiness that I'm plugging in is right here, reflection glossiness, the reflection map, and then my diffuse map are all showing up here. So now I also want to copy this whole tree and use it on the back wall, but with different textures. So if I scroll down here, we'll see I've got this rocks blend, which is this whole node. I'm just going to drag that out and do a copy instead of an instance. And now we've got an exact duplication of that same tree, that material tree. And I'm just going to go into my 3 textures here, just double click, and here where it says bitmap, you can click on this and change the texture that it's referencing. So here I'm going to grab my diffuse, and these I don't want tiled, I just want them one by one. I'm going to grab my spec, rock wall spec, and then my bump. Okay, let's grab this back wall geometry. Close some of these windows. And then just right click and assign material. Okay, and then lastly, I want to make a texture for the floor. The floor was in the shot was going to be getting replaced by the live action footage anyway, but just for lighting information, you know, for when I start doing some GI, I might want, it'll help kind of just the calculation and make it a little more realistic if I have more than just a flat gray material on the floor. So So again, grab blend material, call this ground blend. And now if I come down here to the cellular, this is kind of a noise, but it almost looks like little pebbles. And if we change it to chips, here if I increase the size, you can see it almost looks like little chips of rock that are kind of tiled out, or like a stained glass kind of pattern. And this is just going to be adding some additional detail to the ground. So I'm going to change the size to 0.5 and pump this into my bump. And then again, double click this, go down to my maps, increase the bump to 50. I find 50 is a nice starting point. You can always adjust from there. And then up here to the diffuse, I'm going to go ahead and just change the color to kind of a sandy brown, like we saw in the concept. It's kind of a dusty, chalky color. Maybe even remove some more color out of that. Okay. So here, if we come back to our render preview, instead of view, if you change to region, you get this little red region. We can pick a specific area to kind of drag out and look at just the ground. And here, if we just look at a little bit of ground here and render this, now let me put a plain material on it. Select my ground. Notice the scene will be a little slow because of this high-res geometry we're working with. There we go. I'm just going to assign this plain material to the ground. And just do a quick little render. So you'll see there's not a whole lot going on. There's some detail we sculpted in. Let me cancel that. And now if I switch to the one we just made and do a render again, you'll notice this kind of very small grain breakup we're getting. It's almost making it look like sand or a dirt, which is just helping adding a little detail to that. Okay. So we may come back and adjust the materials after lighting. I usually just like to get materials in with a default light and know that everything's working well. And then I may adjust them later as I get into the final lighting. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this light we have here. And I'm going to start setting up our lighting for the final shot. So I'm going to come back here to the V-Ray light, go to my front view and drag out a light. And this is going to be the light that appears behind the opening. It's going to be kind of our key light. So I want to make it larger than the opening. I'm going to pull it back here, and I'm going to have to rotate it around so it's facing the right direction. The arrow here on the light will show you which way it's directed. I kind of want to increase the size. Here I can see the light. Just want to make it a little bigger. I'm going to make it 8x4. And now one other thing is this light is square, but we have this V opening, so I kind of want to add a few pieces of geometry to help sculpt the shape of this light more into a V shape. So I'm going to come back here to my primitives and just create a couple boxes here. Just make this only, I don't need them to be very thick. So I'm going to drag this behind my wall and rotate this. And it's going to I'm going to kind of create the same V shape behind the wall. Let's change this to local scaling. And again, this is just going to help kind of art direct some of my lighting. And then Control V, I'm just going to copy this, move it over to the sides here, stretch it out. And then copy it to the other side. And these will just be basically for casting shadows or blocking the light. So I'm only getting it really where I need it. Okay, I'm just gonna hitting Control to grab all three of these guys, go back to my material, and I'm just gonna apply this default material I made to them, just to give them a color. And actually, I think I'm gonna make this darker. Okay, and one last thing is, you'll see that this room is completely open. I want to close it off just so that I'm not getting any light spill from some weird areas, or depending on how light might be bouncing later on. So I'm going to create another box here as well. It's going to kind of act as my overall room. Just scale that out. I'm going to give it a subdivision along its length. And then just position this around all my geometry here. Let's scale that down. Let's add an edit poly modifier. And just kind of scale this to the shape of the room here. Move this out so it's going all the way to the wall. And I also want to grab polygons and grab this front face. Just holding Alt to deselect, so I just have the front face selected. I'm just going to go ahead and hit delete on my keyboard just to delete it so it's open, facing out. Okay, and this will just give us some side walls, kind of enclose our cave in this kind of self-contained area. And let's switch out of here. Oh, and I also want to take this and do invert the normals on it. So I'm going to go down here to normal, and flip normals will be checked. So now all the normals are facing inside. Now let's go back to my materials and apply this gray material to that as well. Can I save this? Now let me actually turn down some of these settings just so we're getting a nice quick render here. Just the two, since we're just looking at lighting now. Set this anti-aliasing down and the number of samples down. So let's come back here, change our region to view, and just do a quick render here. See what we're getting with this backlight. No, I didn't change some of the settings on this light. They're using the same default settings. So in here on the multiplier, I'm going to change this to 30 just to increase the brightness, and then I'm going to turn off decay, or no decay. So this way the light will actually decay correctly. So we'll have it be a little brighter the closer it is to the opening, and have some fall off as it gets darker away from the opening. I'm also going to change my sampling subdivisions here to 16. This is just the number of samples it takes on the light, and it'll help smooth out your shadows by increasing this number. Okay, so let's go back and hit render again. And we should see we're getting something already getting close to our final. This key light was providing the majority of the light in the shot. So there'll be some other fill lights. And here we're getting this box I put around the scene is kind of showing up, so we'll just need to lower that a little bit. But you can see it's looking pretty nice. We have this nice directional light from the window. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that really quick. Let's grab our box and just modify this really quick. Add these bottom points and just move them down so they're out of view in our 3D camera here, or our render camera. Okay. Now I'm just going to go ahead and copy this light. So just Control V, copy it. And there's a couple of fill lights I want to make in the scene. So I'm just bringing this over, and now instead of a plane, I want this to be a sphere. I'm going to change its scale down here. Let's do 1 meter. And just kind of put this in the center of the room. And I'm going to change some of the values here. So I want this multiplier to be a lot lower. Actually, I want the size to be a lot smaller too. It's going to be just 1/4 of a meter. Let's bring this down a bit. There we go. So it's kind of in the center of our render camera. Everything else we can leave. I'm going to decrease the subdivisions. We can always increase them later when we go to a final render. For now, I'm just going to put them at 8. So this is kind of our fill light for the scene. And then also, I'm going to copy this again. I also want a little bit of light coming from camera, as if there was maybe a second opening coming from behind camera. Mainly because the subject in the reference was lit from the front a little bit, or from the camera, so I want to put just a little bit of light over here. I'm going to switch this back to a plane. And just using the WER hotkeys to rotate and translate this around. So it's going to be just below my camera out of frame. And let's see, I want this to be kind of just a wide and short light, so just 2 meters. So it's kind of just like a little bar going across. Just going to add a little bit of fill light. Let's see, and I'll leave this multiplier at 10. Let's do a render preview and just see how that's looking. So we'll start to see some of this fill light. We may turn those down a bit. Looks like they're getting kind of bright. Yeah, it's going to be a bit too bright. So let me bring this one down to like 6, and this one, I think maybe 2. Okay, I'm going to pause here and continue in the next video.